Today, we're opening the files on a case that is just deeply tragic and, to this day, completely unresolved. We're talking about a cold case from 2004, Japan. We're going to take a really slow, cinematic look at the facts surrounding a night that literally shattered a quiet community and left, thousands of investigators completely baffled. Our goal here is to honor the memory of the victims by trying to understand the incomprehensible. We'll be piecing together the timeline, the evidence, and the profound, lingering impact of a crime that actually remains open today. Right off the bat, we're faced with the central paradox of this whole case. How exactly does a brutal quadruple murder happen inside a locked house, guarded by a dog, and yet leave absolutely no trace behind? I want you to keep this impossible scenario in mind as we go through the evidence together, because what we're looking at is a meticulously executed act of violence that completely defied standard police procedures. And honestly, it continues to haunt forensic experts even now. Section 1. The quiet before tragedy. Now, to really grasp the sheer shock of this event, we have to ground ourselves in the setting first. Before September 2004, Kutsukake-cho, which is this neighborhood located in Toyoake City within Japan's Aichi Prefecture, was incredibly peaceful. At the very center of our story is the Kato family. Hiroto, who was 45, was a hardworking father employed at a car part manufacturing company. His wife, Toshio, 38, was a deeply devoted mother. Everyone knew her for her cheerful nature, and she worked part-time just to help support her kids' activities. They had 3 children. There was Yuki, 15, an athletic boy; Rina, 13, a really creative girl who loved volleyball; and the youngest, Shogo, who was just 8 years old. Tragically, September 9th, the day of the incident, was actually supposed to be a day of celebration. It was little Shogo's 9th birthday. But, this quiet life had recently been disturbed, and it created this atmosphere of deep, underlying anxiety. The family had actually grown highly security conscious in the months prior. In late July of 2003, they heard this terrifying rattling sound. Someone was literally trying to forcibly open their front door late at night. And then later, in 2004, a suspicious person was seen just lingering, quietly watching the house. Because of this escalating sense of dread, Toshio became obsessive about locking all the ground floor doors and windows every single night. She was absolutely determined to protect her children from whatever was out there in the dark. Section 2, Timeline of the Final Night. Let's trace the chronological events now. We'll move minute by minute through their final evening. What seemed like an ordinary night slowly gave way to an unimaginable nightmare. The evening started out completely normally. At 8:30 p.m., young Shogo was in the living room, just watching a national soccer team match on TV. Then, around 11 p.m., Hiroto called Toshio to let her know he was going to be working late to meet a deadline. He was staying at his office, which was an hour away in Komaki City. Knowing he often forgot his key, he asked her to leave the spare in its usual hiding spot out in the shed. Then, the timeline takes a really dark turn. At 3:40 a.m., a passing truck driver spotted a suspicious blue car with an Owari Komaki license plate, parked ominously near the home. At 4 a.m., the eerie silence of the neighborhood was completely broken. Neighbors reported hearing a woman's terrified scream. And finally, at 4:25 a.m., emergency services received a frantic call. The fire department was dispatched to a massive, raging blaze at the Kato residence. Section 3, the crime scene investigation. This brings us to the harrowing arrival of the first responders. Initially, the firefighters battling the blaze just thought this was a tragic, accidental house fire. But the moment they breached the home, they realized they were walking into a crime scene of unimaginable proportions. The fire hadn't just started by accident. It had been set intentionally, and it burned with this calculated ferocity. Responders described the inside of the house as being literally like a furnace. The blaze was so incredibly intense that it actually warped and bent the home's structural steel columns. Think about the heat required to do that. And this extreme heat incinerated almost all the physical evidence. Footprints, blood traces, skin fragments, hair, and absolutely crucial DNA were completely destroyed in the inferno. It effectively crippled the initial police response before the investigation had even truly begun. The most crucial point for investigators, though, was the sheer impossibility of the scene. The house was entirely locked from the inside. There were absolutely no signs of forced entry. Remember Toshio's strict locking habits we talked about? Well, every single ground floor window was secured shut. And what about that spare key Hiroto had asked Toshio to leave in the shed for him? Investigators found it completely untouched, resting right in the exact spot Toshio always hid it. It presented this baffling challenge for detectives. How on earth did the killer get in? And perhaps more terrifyingly, how did they lock the doors from the inside when they left? Adding to the mystery is a detail that is just truly eerie and deeply unsettling. The Kato family had a guard dog, a Shiba Inu named Jackie. Now, Jackie was known by everyone in the neighborhood to bark loudly and aggressively at strangers. That was her job. Yet neighbors heard absolutely no barking that night. No struggle, no warning whatsoever. Furthermore, Jackie's collar had been carefully removed, and the dog actually survived the raging fire by hiding silently under a car in the yard. So why didn't the dog alert the family? And who took the time in the middle of a quadruple murder to take off its collar? Section 4, the forensic evidence. We must now shift from those environmental anomalies to the stark, heartbreaking forensic facts that were gathered from the ashes. I do want to warn you, this next part discusses the specific methods of the crime, based clinically and entirely on the confirmed autopsy reports. A distinct, very chilling pattern emerged in how the victims were attacked. The male victims, Yuki and Shogo, suffered blunt force trauma to the head, struck by a heavy metal object, something similar to a crowbar. But the female victims, Toshio and Rina, suffered repeated, incredibly violent stab wounds from what investigators determined was a heavy, 20-centimeter survival knife. It was wielded with enough brutal force to actually break ribs. Furthermore, the coroner noted a really devastating detail. There were no defensive wounds on any of the victims. This tells us they were attacked suddenly, while fast asleep in their beds, never even given a chance to fight back. The forensic anomalies only compound the horror here. The coroner found black soot deep in the lungs of all 4 victims. To put that into perspective, this terrifying reality means they were still breathing when the fire was finally set. Investigators also determined that the accelerant used, which was kerosene, was not sourced from the Kato home. The killer actually brought it with them, demonstrating absolute clear premeditation. Finally, a chemical luminol sweep of the yard and the surrounding neighborhood streets found absolutely 0 traces of blood. Despite the sheer, horrific violence inside that house, the killer vanished without leaving a single drop of evidence outside the home. It's almost unbelievable. Section 5. Suspects, leads, and theories. With the physical evidence so severely compromised by the fire, investigators were essentially forced to move away from confirmed physical facts. They had to wade into the murky realm of investigative speculation, exploring every possible lead to find a motive. Human nature being what it is, suspicion naturally fell heavily on the surviving father, Hiroto Kato. But Hiroto had a verified, ironclad alibi. Telecommunications data and witness testimonies solidly confirmed he was making phone calls and was seen at his workplace an hour away during the exact window of the murders. However, a year and a half later, in 2005, Hiroto was actually arrested and convicted for embezzling over 55 million yen from his company using fake invoices. Now, while police explicitly stated they found 0 connection between this white-collar fraud and the murders, you can imagine what happened next. This subsequent arrest ignited a massive media frenzy and fueled intense, relentless public suspicion against him. Then, one of the most bizarre investigative leads came about 2 years later from an underworld informant known in police files simply as T. While being interrogated for an entirely separate crime, T claimed to have intimate knowledge of the perpetrators. During questioning, he accurately picked out photographs of both Toshio and a woman Hiroto was having an affair with, and he picked them out from a massive, really complex lineup. T claimed a hit was ordered using a meticulously crafted duplicate key, and that the murders were carried out by a combination of Yakuza members and foreign nationals. But despite this chillingly specific narrative, the story remains unconfirmed. Not a single arrest was ever made based on his testimony. Over 58,000 investigators have worked this case over the decades. They've exhausted numerous theories in this desperate search for the truth. Was it a random home invasion? Well, that theory quickly fell apart because Toshio's wallet was left completely untouched right on a table. No valuables, no cash, no bank books were stolen at all. Was it a highly targeted hit linked to Hiroto's embezzlement, revenge from a jealous hostess, or perhaps a terrifying, tragic case of mistaken identity? Without a confession, an eyewitness, or some kind of breakthrough in DNA technology, these remain purely theories, just floating in the void of a totally stalled investigation. Section 6. The Unsolved Legacy. As time marches on, we have to look at why this case remains unsolved. We also need to examine the profound, long-term societal impact of this crime on the people left behind. The psychological toll on the surviving father has been absolute and devastating. Driven by the unrelenting glare of media suspicion, Hiroto Kato has completely withdrawn from the public eye. When he was finally approached by a journalist years later, he delivered this truly agonizing quote. He said, "No matter what I do, I'll still be seen as a suspect. It's the police's job to solve cases. I want to be left alone." He hasn't attended the annual memorial events. He's chosen a life of total isolation, forever branded by a court of public opinion. But others refused to let the case just fade into the shadows. Toshio's sister, Toshio Amami, channeled her immense grief into resilient action. She joined an organization called Soranokai, which is a powerful advocacy group for families of murder victims. Through their tireless, coordinated campaigning and their absolute refusal to be silenced, Japan actually officially abolished the statute of limitations for capital offenses in 2010. It's a monumental legal shift. And it means that no matter how much time passes, the killer of the Kato family can still, legally, be brought to justice. Which leaves us with this final, haunting question. This entire case represents a total breakdown of forensic transparency and investigative certainty. We are left looking at a quiet residential street where, on a September night, someone committed an unspeakable act, carefully locked the door behind them, and vanished into thin air. 20 years later, the silence of the Toyoake case continues to echo. Thank you so much for joining me for today's Explainer.